Specs and really using your camera are two different ways of learning about a new piece of technology. And today I want to focus on the use case of the iPhone 15 Pro. I don't want to be an echo chamber for videos that you've already seen. I want to give you real world scenarios that you will find yourself in if you are a filmmaker or a content creator of any kind. Because when you're out in the field actually shooting with this camera, the specs no longer matter. Yes, it can shoot in 4K 60 ProRes Log external, but does it get too hot to touch? And how fast is the battery drain? Also, if you're recording externally with a USB-C, there's no way to charge the phone through the USB-C port, so you're limited to however much battery life is left on the phone. Or are you? It's things like that I want to cover. This video is not a don't go out and buy the iPhone 15 Pro because of its limitations. It's also not a video on, hey, go out and buy the 15 Pro because it's so great. I want this video to be more about me sharing my experience with you and giving you the pros and cons so you can make an informed purchase decision. I don't want any of you guys to go out and purchase this phone without knowing all of the strengths and weaknesses that this camera has. And once you have those understandings, then you can make your informed decision. Just know that every single camera that you have will have compromises. And as long as you know what those compromises are, then you can make your decision. Too many times I get excited about all the hype, I go and buy the camera, and then I find myself disappointed from limitations that I didn't know it had. So I just want to put everything on the table so that when limitations start popping up for you, you're like, oh, I expected that to happen. I'm going to answer the questions that I had, that you've asked me, and some of the questions that have been floating around the internet that no one really seems to have the answers to. Let me know if you have any more questions that I might have missed or skipped over in this video, but hold up on your questions until you get to the end of the video because we cover a lot. Now that I've had the 15 Pro for a while and I've shot a lot with it, I'm comfortable to share with you my thoughts. I shot in ProRes Log, externally and internally, straight out of camera, outdoors, indoors, action shots, cinematic shots, in low light, the love of my life, a cute rabbit. I used the 15 Pro as an overhead camera, a couple of vlog shots. I shot in studio lighting at night, and a little sequence where I shot both straight out of camera and in ProRes, and I'll be putting those two images together so that you can see the true difference between straight out of camera and ProRes as the video progresses. I also used the Blackmagic app to get some of those 4K 60 shots, internal ProRes Log, and let me tell you, it is a game changer. I even set up this side shortcut button as the quick access function for the Blackmagic app because that's how good it is. And it's free, by the way. But first, let's talk about if you were just a beginner or someone who wanted to unbox the iPhone and just start shooting with it. All of the videos that you've seen up until this point have been shot straight out of camera in 4K 24 and 4K 60 in cinematic mode using that wide angle lens, the telephoto lens, and the main lenses. I did throw the 15 Pro onto a gimbal to get some of those harder to reach shots and a selfie stick to get some of those low angle shots. But other than that, it was all handheld and straight out of the native camera app. I'll be sharing all the videos that I got with you as the video progresses so you can see if it's something that you like or maybe you don't like. And as we get further in the video, I'll show you some of those ProRes Log shots and how I was able to expose for those, and also some tips and tricks when you're shooting in ProRes Log on the 15 Pro. Before I purchased the 15 Pro, I wasn't expecting too much because it is an iPhone and phones produce phone quality. You get an over-sharpened image with everything in focus because of the smaller sensor size. The footage looks jittery from higher shutter speeds in brighter environments, and the skin tones always look kind of fake and softened. Because the aperture is fixed, the shutter speed goes too high, and that increases the sharpness of the image. Now, there are ways to mitigate that, and I'll talk about that later in the video. But my point is, no matter how much people were raving about the 15 Pro, at the end of the day, it is a cell phone. When I've used iPhones in the past, the images always look digital and nothing cinematic, not like you would get with the Sony a6700. I'm gonna create a video on the a6700 versus the iPhone 15 Pro so you can really see a difference between an iPhone 15 Pro and a dedicated content creation camera, so make sure to look out for that. I'll put it in the description once it's complete. By the way, if you like videos like this one where I give you tips and tricks on how to make better videos, make sure to join the Film Alliance by subscribing. Alright, so now into the heart of the video. I mainly use the a7S III, which I'm using right now, as my main A-cam in professional work, and I'll use the Sony a6700 and the Sony FX30 as my main B-cams. So I'm used to a very high quality image. But after getting home and seeing most of the footage that I shot with the 15 Pro on my big screens, I saw what all the hype was about. I say most of the footage because the iPhone 15 Pro is not perfect. It definitely has limitations, especially when shooting in low light. But it does take a huge leap forward for those of you who want to film more quality cinematic looking videos with your phones. For me, it was a huge leap forward coming from an iPhone SE, which I had for about 5 years, and also got nibbled on by that little bunny that we've been seeing throughout this video. So getting the iPhone 15 Pro was a huge upgrade, mainly due to the fact that you can shoot in ProRes Log, which to me doesn't even look like phone footage anymore. Apple Log does not apply that same type of oversaturation and over contrast and over sharpening that you would get normally when you shoot straight out of the native camera app. It gives you the ability to colorize and stylize your footage how you want it to look rather than just letting the camera sensor decide what the color should look like. Log footage in most cases, as long as it was exposed correctly, has a higher dynamic range and more color grading flexibility than, say, linear footage that we used to get with iPhones from the past. Log footage is similar to shooting raw footage, and when you shoot in RAW, you can push and pull colors all over the place and make your videos look more stylized and give it more of a customized look. Rather than just shooting some video and then being stuck with the colors that are baked in, you can't really adjust anything other than saturation and the shadows a little bit. To give you an example of what has happened to me in the past, you will have a problem if you're shooting a sequence of clips and then you go to edit them and they're not matching up in colors because of the different lighting environments. These are small subtleties that really take your videos to the next level, and if you don't get a hold of them, then your videos will continue to lag. Log provides a very flat image with a lot more dynamic range, and if you use Final Cut Pro, you can add that Apple Log corrective LUT, which takes the image about 80% of the way there. You still have to do some tweaks, but it's not like you're having to start from scratch to color grade it. If you have an older version of Final Cut Pro before they updated it, or if you're using a different editor, you can use color wheels to get your clip to a decent spot of how you like. But a true colorist could use DaVinci Resolve because it is supported by Resolve. Most people probably won't want to use ProRes Log because of the extra know-how, the editing software that you'll have to get, the workflow, and the file size that accompanies it. But to have that option as a filmmaker is a huge benefit. Now, the image that you get straight out of camera is what most people want and all that they need. And the clips that I've been showing you up until this point, other than the comparisons, they've been straight out of camera with no color grading at all. And you may look at that and think, hey, it looks good to me. And if you thought that, then you're exactly who Apple was targeting. But if you thought those shots weren't all that good, then you're also who Apple kept in mind by giving us ProRes Log. Shooting with ProRes Log, something the iPhone 15 does not have, was very freeing for me for getting the highest possible quality image without having to compromise on baked-in colors. To me, it doesn't even look like iPhone footage, especially when you use the Blackmagic app, but the trade-off is the file size. Get this, 1 minute of ProRes Log in 4K 24 is 5.7 gigabytes, whereas 1 minute of HDR video is 537 megabytes, and an SDR video that is 1 minute long is only 285 megabytes. As a side note, I prefer SDR over HDR because to me, HDR looks a little too digital. Think about that file size difference and how fast it all adds up. To put that into perspective, let me show you this. Out of the box with the 256 gigabyte iPhone Pro, when I shoot in 4K 24 ProRes Log internally, I get 37 minutes of filming. If I hook up an external SSD like this Samsung T3, you get 89 minutes in 4K 24, 72 minutes in 4K 30, and 36 minutes in 4K 60. And if I hook up an external SSD that's 2 terabytes, I get 359 minutes in 4K 24, 288 minutes in 4K 30, and 144 minutes in 4K 60. That's why it makes ProRes a great feature, but certainly not for everybody, especially if your use case is just having a phone that you can pull out and take some videos of your pet bunny or while you're on vacation. Once you do use ProRes, you'll also have to grade it in an editing software like DaVinci Resolve or Final Cut Pro, which wouldn't work for a lot of people who have very basic editors, say like iMovie. Although I wonder if you can edit it in iMovie. I color graded my ProRes Log in Final Cut Pro, and I worked on the saturation, the contrast, and the highlights. When shooting with ProRes Log, I underexposed the iPhone by about 1 stop, because that seems to give me the most room to grade with the least amount of noise. If you don't know what that means, I just pull the exposure compensation down to -1 or thereabouts. If you want a detailed video on how I grade my ProRes Log footage out of the iPhone, let me know. I graded it just like I grade my A7S III when I'm shooting in S-Log 3, but when I do a headshot like this with my A7S III, I first take it through Timebolt. If you're wondering what that is, that brings us to today's sponsor, which is Timebolt, and let me tell you a little bit more about it. First of all, I was a user of Timebolt before we even started this collaboration, so this sponsorship is very organic. Timebolt has single-handedly saved me so much time in my editing process, and when you put out as much creative content as I try to do, then you try to come up with ways to make your workflow more efficient. Check this out. You drag your headshot into Timebolt, and it automatically removes all of the silent parts between your sentences, so you can literally go through your entire timeline and start popping in B-roll. And if that's not enough, Timebolt has its own editor that can add chapters embedded embedded into the videos. So the videos that you upload to YouTube will automatically be pre-timestamped. There are so many shortcuts that you can use that Final Cut Pro doesn't even offer. But if you do still use Final Cut Pro, you can export FCP XML files right into Final Cut Pro, which are still fully editable clips, so you don't have to rely on anything being baked in. And I keep on getting astonished how Timebolt keeps on coming out with unprecedented updates. You guys gotta check them out. Alright, so if you're ready to start editing faster, then I'm going to leave a 20% discount link in the description. I promise you, you will thank me later. Now let's get back to our video. Alright, the video straight out of the iPhone to me looks more like iPhone footage compared to, say, a dedicated camera like the Sony a6700. It has that more digital look, but not as digital as previous iPhones that I've used in the past, if that makes any sense. It does give some skin softening effects that I'm not a fan of and makes skin tones almost look fake. But when you shoot in ProRes, you get a much realer looking image like what you would get with a dedicated camera. I loved using cinematic mode, and once I started to use it, I couldn't really go back to the regular camera because everything was in focus with the regular camera due to that small sensor size. And there's just not enough blur for my liking. But cinematic mode came with some serious drawbacks, and I'll lay those out for you right now. I know from previous iPhones, cinematic mode was kind of gimmicky unless you stop up to say like F7, but I don't know. When I stopped down to F2 when I was out in the field and I saw some of the footage, I thought it looked pretty good until I got home and put it on my big screen. That's when I could really see that digital blur, which kind of looks fake, and it doesn't look like a real actual lens blur like you would get with a Sony a6700 or a dedicated camera. But it wasn't so fake that someone like my mom wouldn't notice a difference, or someone who just was casually shooting. Also, while I was in cinematic mode, I tried to do a little bit of vlogging with it, and it would only focus on one of our faces at a time. It would kind of jump back and forth between the two. So that would be another drawback to using cinematic mode. You can't really vlog with it unless you make sure that both of your faces are exactly in front of the lens at the same distance at the same focal plane. I wouldn't use cinematic mode to shoot an actual cinematic movie. It's cool and it's fun, but that's about it. You also cannot shoot in Prores Log while you're in cinematic mode, and you lose the ability to shoot in 4K 60, so you're kind of set with either 4K 30 or 4K 24. I set my cinematic to default at 4K 24. The iPhone stabilization is really good, similar to an action camera like a GoPro or an Osmo Action. Whether you're vlogging or you're just going handheld, the footage from the iPhone looks close to gimbal-like footage. You have to turn on enhanced stabilization because if you don't, you lose that smooth footage effect. If you were to turn off enhanced stabilization, this is what it looks like. And when you turn it on, this is what it looks like. And when you turn action mode on, this is what it looks like. And this is handheld just walking through the woods. I did use a gimbal and a selfie stick, as I mentioned already, to get some of those lower angle shots, things that my arms just couldn't do. But the iPhone's action mode is mind-blowing, but it does come with the drawback. The resolution drops down to 2.8K. I could absolutely see quality drop off, especially when I put the footage on the big screen. I got these low angle four-wheeler shots in pretty low light environment and was disappointed in how they turned out. While I was shooting it, I thought this was going to be the introduction to that little cinematic sequence that I put together, but it turned out to be very noisy and grainy, and you have to use that action mode in a well-lit environment, because if you go low light, then this is what happens. Also, an interesting observation that I made is when you go action mode, you actually have a negative crop because it reverts back to that wider lens, even at that same focal length. In my experience, when you use stabilization, cameras like to crop in, but in this case, it actually crops back. Just something to know about. The three focal lengths you get are 24, 28, and 35 millimeters. The equivalent would be 1 times, 1.2 times, and 1.5 times zoom of that 24 millimeter. When I used the wide angle lens, I noticed that the image quality went down quite a bit. An interesting thing that Apple does is they use these three lenses sort of randomly and separately for different focal lengths. For example, I went through all of the focal lengths, and for some reason, I couldn't activate this top lens, and I couldn't figure out why. But once I went out of the camera app and came back in, and I did it to telephoto or wide, I can't remember which one it was, it finally activated. But I did notice that in the Blackmagic app, you can actually decide which one of these three lenses you want to use, so you have more manual control on which one of these lenses that you need for your shot, rather than having Apple decide by cropping in, say, the 24 millimeter to get some of those telephoto shots. This is the 13 millimeter wide lens on the top here. This is the 24 millimeter main camera lens, and this is the telephoto lens. The different frame rates and resolutions you get are 720/30, 1080/30, 1080/60, 4K24, 4K30, and 4K60. And slow motion, you'll be able to shoot in 1080/240, 720/240, and 1080/120. If you want to shoot in ProRes, you'll only be able to shoot in 4K24 or 4K30 internally, but you can shoot in 4K60 if you hook up an external SSD or use a third-party app like the Blackmagic app. Other than deciding which resolution and frame rates you want, short of pressing the display to lock exposure in the focus, you're kind of stuck with the phone in program auto. You can always exposing for what you think looks best. You can still turn on exposure compensation, but you don't really have any control over the ISO or shutter speed. My workaround for this to get some of those nice low light shots is I would just hold my finger on the brightest part of the image on the display so I could lock my exposure and my focus, and then I would take my shot. You could get some NDs for the outside of your lenses to control that shutter speed better, especially in brighter environments, and I'll leave a link to some that I know about in the description. The Blackmagic camera app gives you things the native camera app on the iPhone just doesn't have, such as better exposure control with zebras, false color, and a sort of interface of an actual Blackmagic cinema camera, and the ability to add preview LUTs. Being in control of the white balance and the ISO makes a huge difference. On the Blackmagic app, you can also change codecs to other smaller ProRes options, even H.265 and H.264, all in 4K 60 frames per second log. If you're serious about using the iPhone 15 Pro as a filmmaking camera, then I think you're gonna have to pick up the Blackmagic camera app. You can even record horizontally even when your phone is in the vertical orientation, which is pretty insane. Also, as of right now, you can record externally to an SSD using the Blackmagic camera app. So just go ahead and download that one. If you would like a video on my workflow inside of the Blackmagic camera app, let me know. If you were planning on vlogging with the iPhone, I would invest in a lav mic system or a little mic that you can add to the top with a cage, really just to up your game in the audio. Here we are doing an audio test with the iPhone 15 Pro in 4K24 using the front-facing camera. I want to see what this sounds like, but also I want to see what the frame looks like. I know I talked about how the iPhone kind of messes with skin tones. Well, this is a good example of what I mean by that. All right, so here we are using the rear-facing camera. I do see a little mic port underneath the cameras, so maybe this audio is going to sound better than the front-facing camera, but either way, it's a good test between both sides of the camera, which one delivers better audio. All right, so here's cinematic mode. I want you guys to pay attention to the skin tones and how they don't really look that realistic, and also the kind of that fake digital blur that we get in the background. Now we're shooting in 4K24 ProRes Log internal on the camera because I want to see how much better this image looks like than straight out of camera like we were doing. The audio doesn't sound too bad, but once you compare that to better sounding audio, then you really understand that it could use an audio upgrade. Being able to copy files from the iPhone 15 Pro straight to your computer with USB-C 3.0 speeds is a huge upgrade from what we used to get with the Lightning ports only being able to transfer footage at USB-C 2.0 speeds. Especially now that we have ProRes footage, the faster speeds are extremely helpful. Having a USB-C also enables us to have that external recording feature. The whole minimalist setup is ruined when I start adding external drives to the outside of this camera, and it makes it a little bit more cumbersome, but when it comes to ProRes, I'll take that because the footage is that good. But if you're into a minimalist setup, then you're probably not going to want to shoot in 4K 60 ProRes Log because you'll have to record externally unless you get the Blackmagic camera app, and then you don't have to hook up anything to your phone. People are complaining about overheating, and yes, it gets hot for me, but it never actually overheated in 4K 60 internal. I recorded for over an hour straight, and in my test, the phone did not shut off, but it did get pretty darn hot. But I can't see a use case scenario where I would ever shoot in 4K 60 for that long of a period of time. I usually shoot my B-roll in 4K 60 in slow bursts, and that's what I did with this phone. And while I had it outside in about 75-degree weather, it didn't overheat or get hot on me at all. There is a reduced heat dissipation area inside of the new titanium frame, which in my opinion is why we're getting overheating issues, but I believe a software update will fix that or at least help. I tried hooking up a USB-C hub to charge the camera while simultaneously externally recording in ProRes Log, but from my tests, I couldn't get the phone to do both at the same time. It's not like you can just swap out your iPhone battery while you're on set, especially if you're recording externally because you're blocking the charging port. So the question that arises to me that I'll ask to you is, what will you be using your iPhone 15 Pro for? These are questions you have to ask. We've heard all the great stuff and all the neat upgrades that the 15 Pro had, but it does come with compromises advantages and limitations. In low light, the images just fall apart if you're not shooting in ProRes Log, and although the low light performance has drastically improved from previous iPhones, I wouldn't use it professionally in a low light situation. I love the weight of this thing. It's a lot lighter than iPhones from the past. The buttons are clickier and the apps load a lot faster. The 422 color space should also help a lot when it comes to green screen work if you're into that. I think if you have anything before the iPhone 13, the 15 Pro would be a great upgrade. Because this camera can shoot in 422 10-bit, I think it would make a great B cam for something like the Sony a6700 or other cameras that can also shoot in 422 10-bit log, because you'll be able to color grade that footage to match a lot closer. I'm sure happy with it, even with its limitations, and I plan to bring it along with me and shoot in ProRes Log when I'm in a pinch, not as my end goal, but kind of as a side camera or as a C cam when my A cam and B cams are tied up doing something else. I really hope all of this information helps you out on making your decision on if you want to pick up this camera or not. I'm Joe with the Film Alliance. Thank you so much for watching, and until the next one, have a great week.